He's just the maintenance guy, she jeered. But that maintenance guy was about to prevent a war they were completely blind to. The gentle scrape of the mop was the only mechanical sound in a universe of digital signals. Arthur Art Miller, aged 74, moved with a slow, deliberate cadence that was entirely invisible to the brilliant young intellects surrounding him. Here, inside the U.S. Navy's drone control hub in Norfolk, a hushed sanctuary of illuminated screens and classified information, Art was a phantom. His reality was the scent of disinfectant and the quiet fulfillment of a floor so polished it mirrored the frenetic, tumbling code on the monitors above. The maintenance uniform was a cloak of irrelevance, making him little more than a piece of the background to the officers and analysts who conversed in a dialect of acronyms and code. Today, the sanctuary was electric with stress. A critical simulation was in motion. A mock digital assault on their most advanced fleet of hunter-killer drones. At the heart of the crisis was Commander Eva Rostova, a woman whose ambition was as sharp and unforgiving as the silver insignia on her collar. She commanded the room like a maestro in a concert hall, precise, commanding, and with no room for a single wrong note. Her team, the Navy's most elite digital combatants, had run into a dead end. Status. Rostova's voice was a blade cutting through the low hum. "No change, Commander," a young lieutenant responded, his fingers dancing across a keyboard. "The phantom signal is self-correcting. It's not just jamming our control frequencies, it's rewriting them on the fly. We can't establish a digital beachhead." On the main display, the symbols for a dozen drones, each a multi-million-dollar asset, shifted from a reassuring blue to an ominous, static red. The exercise was a spectacular failure. Rostova's expression became granite. Her systems, the most advanced on Earth, were being systematically taken apart by a foe that left no digital trail. Art paused his work near a peripheral diagnostics screen, his back to the main theater of operations. He shouldn't have been looking, but the shimmering light patterns had snagged his attention. A cascade of alphanumeric symbols scrolled down the display. Incomprehensible to most, but to Art, it was a language he hadn't spoken in decades. He leaned on his mop, his tired eyes deciphering the structure of the hostile code. He recognized its signature, or something very much like it, from another life, another conflict. It was unsophisticated but brilliant, an ancient predator dressed in modern clothes. Unconsciously, he murmured to the empty air, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that vanished into the room's background noise. "It's a parasitic frequency, leeching onto the carrier wave's attenuation." He shook his head, a wry, melancholy smile forming. "They're using firewalls. You don't need a wall, you need a tuning fork. Just reverse the analog phase loop. It'll choke on its own signal." He blinked, as if surfacing from a deep thought, and returned to his mop, becoming the quiet maintenance man in his quiet world again. Just an old man talking to himself, another ghost in the machine. Rostova, pacing behind the consoles, noticed the old man's reflected gaze on a dark screen. For a fleeting instant, her frustration found a convenient target. She leaned toward her second-in-command, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, and dropped her voice to a conspiratorial whisper laced with scorn. "Look at him, gawking at the data stream like he gets it." She let out a short, biting laugh. "Pay him no mind, Thorne. He's just the handyman." Thorne offered up perfunctory nod, his eyes flicking to the old man before returning to his station, the dismissal complete. Rostova turned her attention back to the crisis, the handyman already expunged from her strategic calculus. She had no way of knowing that the man she'd just written off had once commanded 7-man recon units deep in the Hindu Kush, fluent in Pashto, Farsi, and Russian. She couldn't conceive of him field stripping a signal jammer with just a pocket knife and a strand of wire in the monsoon-soaked jungles of Central America. To her, he was art, the silent man who emptied their wastebaskets and polished away their footprints. But someone else had noticed. Admiral Vance, a man whose calm presence belied a mind that missed nothing, had been watching the simulation from the command deck above. As he descended the steps to have a word with Rostova, he passed directly behind Art just as the old handyman whispered his diagnosis. Vance, whose own career began in the analog era of Cold War submarines, stopped in his tracks. The terminology, parasitic frequency, carrier waves attenuation, reverse the phase loop, was more than technical jargon. They were phrases from a buried chapter of electronic warfare. They were words a handyman should not know. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. He looked from Art's stooped posture to the bewildered analysts and their silent, multi-million-dollar equipment. He said nothing to Rostova. Instead, he turned and walked back to his office with a newfound sense of urgency. I want the complete service record for Arthur Miller, not the contractor file. I want the classified, deep storage file, the one from the archives. Moments later, a slim, heavily redacted dossier lay on his desk. Most pages were a sea of black ink, but the words that remained were breathtaking. Arthur Miller wasn't just a veteran, he was a legend scrubbed from history. His record was a series of classified assignments and commendations so secret they had no descriptions. Vance saw phrases, Project Nightingale, acoustic EW specialist, lead analyst Soviet interception. He found a citation for unorthodox counterintelligence during the redacted incident. A note at the bottom, almost unreadable, mentioned proficiency in 7 languages and an expertise in defunct signal frameworks. Vance leaned back, a cold certainty settling in. Arthur Miller, the man who mopped his floors, was a living artifact, a Cold War virtuoso who had been erased from the official narrative and put out to pasture. The man Rostova had dismissed as just the handyman had forgotten more about electronic warfare than her entire team of prodigies would ever know. The Admiral picked up his secure phone. "Assign a 24-hour surveillance detail to Arthur Miller," he said quietly. "Low profile. I just want his location at all times. And pull everything we have on analog phase reversal protocols from the 1980s. A week later, the simulation became a reality. 2,000 miles away, during a high-stakes joint operation with the British Royal Navy in the North Atlantic, the unthinkable occurred. An entire wing of MQ-4C Triton surveillance drones went silent, their video feeds dissolving into white noise. Then they began to move with a will of their own, breaking formation and turning east toward Russian waters. It wasn't a jam, it was a hijacking. The Norfolk Command Center became a hornet's nest of controlled panic. Rostova, her face pale and taut, issued orders that accomplished nothing. "I have no digital connection, no telemetry, no handshake," an analyst shouted, sweat glistening on his forehead. "They're flying blind, but something is giving them commands." This was no drill. This was an international incident brewing, with hundreds of millions of dollars in military technology about to be lost to an adversary. As every digital countermeasure failed, Admiral Vance watched the silent, stoic fury on Rostova's face. He had seen enough. "Get me Arthur Miller," he commanded, his voice cutting through the tense air. His aides stared blankly. The maintenance man, sir?" "No," Vance repeated. His tone brooked no argument. Moments later, the doors slid open and Art was escorted in, still in his drab gray uniform, holding a dust rag. The frantic energy of the room seemed to part around his quiet form. Whispers broke out. Rostova shot a look of incredulity at the Admiral. Vance ignored her, gesturing Art toward the main screen. "Mr. Miller, your thoughts." Art walked to the central console, his old eyes scanning the corrupted data and the erratic paths of the rogue drones. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the frantic tapping of keys. Then he pointed a weathered finger at a subtle wave pattern in the background interference, a phantom image nearly invisible to the others. "Kresnoe Prizrak," he said, his voice soft but carrying the authority of decades. "The Red Ghost. Soviet design. I thought they shelved this in '87. He looked at the Admiral, then at Rostova. "It doesn't broadcast. It vibrates along the drone's own magnetic field." He tapped the screen. "You're all hunting for a radio wave, but this is a resonance. Your systems aren't built to listen for it." The command center fell deathly silent, broken only by the Admiral's order. "Commander Rostova, step away. Give Mr. Miller the chair." For a moment, Rostova looked as if she'd been struck. "Sir, with all due respect," she began, her voice tight with professional outrage. "This is not a history seminar. This is a live tactical emergency involving assets worth more than your department's annual budget." "It is a history lesson, Commander," Vance retorted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that no one dared challenge. "Step away." Defeated, her face a mask of cold fury and humiliation, Rostova stepped back. The young analyst at the primary console looked up, utterly bewildered, as the old handyman shuffled forward. Art placed his dust rag neatly on the edge of the console, a small, absurd island of the mundane in a sea of technological crisis. He sat down, the worn fabric of his uniform stuck against the ergonomic, high-tech chair. His hands, gnarled with age and arthritis, hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then he ignored it. "Don't need this," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. He pushed the touchscreen interface aside. "Give me an oscilloscope display of the raw carrier frequency. Kill all automated filters. I want to hear the signal." "Hear it?" an analyst stammered. "Sir, it's just white noise." "Get it for him," Vance commanded. A moment later, a chaotic green line jagged across a black screen, and a low-level static hissed from the speakers. The team exchanged incredulous looks. While they fought with algorithms and predictive models, the handyman wanted to listen to static. Art closed his eyes, his head tilted slightly. He was no longer a maintenance man. He was a musician, tuning an instrument in a hurricane. For a full minute, he just listened, his face impassive. The rogue drones continued their eastward trajectory on the main map. Tense minutes ticked by. Rostova stood with her arms crossed, her expression a perfect portrait of skepticism. "There," Art said suddenly, his eyes snapping open. He pointed to the oscilloscope. "That dip, every 12 seconds. It's the system's pulse, a flaw in the original design. They never fixed it." On the screen, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip in the wave appeared and vanished. No modern diagnostic program would have flagged it. It was just a whisper in the noise. They're using the drone's own power source to amplify the ghost signal. The more you fight it digitally, the stronger it gets. You have to cut the head off the snake. He turned to the bewildered analyst. "Do you still have manual frequency modulators in this system? Not digital, a physical dial." The analyst blinked. I think so. In the legacy hardware bay, they haven't been used since before I was born." "Get one, and patch it into the primary comms relay," Art ordered, a lifetime of command authority returning to his voice. As technicians scrambled to hook up the dusty, archaic piece of equipment, Rostova finally broke her silence. "What are you going to do with that? Throw a rock at them?" Art didn't look at her. He simply said, "A tuning fork." With the modulator patched in, Art placed his hand on the large round dial. He was no longer looking at the screens. He was watching the oscilloscope and listening to the static. His fingers, which had trembled slightly when holding the dust rag, were now perfectly still. He began to turn the dial slowly, a millimeter at a time. The pitch of the static began to change, rising and falling with microscopic precision. He was hunting, not with code, but with frequency, with feel.
"You're creating a feedback loop," Rostova whispered, a dawning, horrified understanding in her eyes. It's acoustically brute force. It could fry the drone's entire comms system." "It won't," Art said without turning. "Not if you hit the right note at the right time." He continued to tune, his focus absolute. He was a safecracker listening for a tumbler to fall. The room held its breath. The drone icons on the map were nearing a critical line. "Now," he breathed. At the exact moment the telltale dip in the wave on the oscilloscope appeared, he pushed a single large button on the old modulator. For a second, nothing happened. Then the green line on the oscilloscope went wild. The ghost signal, force-fed its own amplified echo at its most vulnerable moment, spiked violently. The hissing static from the speakers rose to a deafening shriek that lasted for 3 agonizing seconds before it suddenly imploded. Silence. On the main screen, the 12 drone icons flickered. Red. Red. Then, one by one, they blinked back to a steady, beautiful, friendly blue. "We have control," an analyst cried out, his voice cracking with relief. "All assets responding. They're turning back to base." A wave of cheers and applause erupted through the command center. Men and women half a century younger than Art were laughing, clapping each other on the back. The immense pressure of the last hour released in a single joyous burst. But Rostova wasn't cheering. She stood frozen, staring at the old man who was now calmly wiping his hands on his dust rag. He hadn't just saved the drones. He had shattered her entire worldview. The digital fortress she had built her career on had been breached, and the day was saved by a ghost from a forgotten war, using methods she had dismissed as primitive. As the celebration subsided, she walked slowly toward Art. The room quieted, sensing the gravity of the moment. She stopped in front of him, her expression unreadable. Then, in a gesture that stunned everyone, she reached up and unclipped her officer's headset, the symbol of her command. The click of the jack being unplugged echoed in the sudden quiet. She held it out to him, not with a flourish, but with a simple, profound solemnity. It was the ultimate sign of professional surrender and respect. No words were needed. She was acknowledging that in this arena, he was the master and she was the student. Art looked at the headset in her hands, then up at her face. He saw no arrogance left, only a raw, humbled respect. He gave a small, quiet nod and accepted it. Arthur Miller never went back to his mop. The day after the North Atlantic incident, his janitorial contract was terminated. Admiral Vance called him into his office, where his old, threadbare uniform was replaced by a simple civilian suit. "Your mop is officially retired, Mr. Miller, but your country is not done with you yet." He didn't return to a command console either. Instead, he was given a small, forgotten office in the base's archives, a room filled with the scent of old paper and aging leather-bound books. From this quiet headquarters, he became the head of a new, highly classified and deeply unconventional unit, Project Guardian. Its mission was not to develop new technology, but to rediscover the old.
Art was tasked with scouring the country for the ghosts of the American military, the retired, the forgotten, the men and women whose skills had been deemed obsolete by a world obsessed with digital perfection. He and his small team, which now included a humbled and fiercely loyal Commander Rostova as his executive officer, traveled to VFW halls, sleepy retirement communities, and remote towns. They weren't looking for decorated generals, they were looking for forgotten craftsmen. They found a 92-year-old retired Navy radio man in a nursing home in Maine who could still pull clean Morse code out of a signal buried in solar flare interference, a skill that saved a stranded submarine crew during a communications blackout. They recruited a former Army cartographer from Montana who could read a topographical map and predict enemy movements with an intuition that no satellite algorithm could match, preventing a disastrous ambush in a training exercise. They found a shipwright in Louisiana who could diagnose a hairline fracture in a destroyer's hull just by the sound it made, using a technique his grandfather had taught him. These were the Guardians. Art didn't train them, he listened to them. He collected their knowledge, their instincts, and their stories, creating a living library of human experience. Rostova, with her brilliant strategic mind, became the bridge, translating their analog wisdom into actionable protocols for the modern Navy. She learned that true strength wasn't in having the most advanced systems, but in knowing their limitations and having the wisdom to look beyond them. The unit became the military's best-kept secret, a quiet legion of guardians who solved problems the digital world couldn't even see. 3 years later, Project Guardian was a thriving, essential part of U.S. naval intelligence. Art, now 77 and moving a little slower, decided his work was done. There were no farewell ceremonies, no speeches, no medals. That was never his way. On his last day, he sat in his quiet office as the afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows. Commander Rostova entered, followed by a sharp, bright-eyed young drone pilot, Lieutenant Jacobs, who was considered the best of the new generation. She was the future, a master of systems and code that Art could barely comprehend.
"We just wanted to thank you, Art," Rostova said, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. "You didn't just teach us new tricks, you reminded us what the foundation of all this is built on." Art smiled, a gentle, tired expression. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were yellowed and filled with his own spidery, handwritten notes, diagrams, frequencies, and observations from a lifetime of listening to the world's secret conversations. He held it out to Lieutenant Jacobs. "Everything in here is already in the Guardian database, sir," the young lieutenant said respectfully. "We've digitized every last protocol." Art's smile widened slightly. He pressed the notebook into her hands. "You digitized the instructions," he said gently, "not the instincts. This book has the smudges, the notes I made in the margins when I was wrong, the coffee stains from nights spent listening to ghosts. It has the mistakes." He tapped the cover with a weathered finger. "The database can tell you what to do. This will help you understand why." He stood up slowly, ready to walk out of the archives and back into the quiet anonymity he cherished. As he reached the door, he looked back at the young pilot, who was staring down at the old book as if it were a sacred text. "Some things," Art said, his voice barely a whisper but echoing with the weight of a lifetime, "Google can't tell you." He walked out, leaving the future in their hands, confident that the lessons of the past were finally safe. In a world of gleaming screens and infinite data, the most powerful weapon was still a quiet wisdom passed from one generation to the next, not through a fiber optic cable, but in the pages of a dusty, handwritten book.